People ask me a lot of questions. Questions such as, where can I get that Game Boy Player controller? And why do you say Sega Genesis if you're British? You're supposed to say Mega Drive. I bet you're not even from England, you big fakey faker. To which I say, fuck you. But one of the questions I'm most frequently asked is, why don't you look at virtual console games? I get tweets, texts and emails asking me to look at, say, the Wii version of Earthbound or the Wii release of Ocarina of Time, or I'll be asked about digital re-releases of old arcade games like X-Men or the Mortal Kombat Arcade Collection, and each time I give the same answer. They're not ports. Then there's the people who ask me when I'm going to cover games like Metal Gear Solid The Twin Snakes on the GameCube or DuckTales Remastered, which are both fascinating titles with rich and colourful histories. But they're not ports either. They're remakes, brand new games built from scratch based on earlier titles. Which brings me to my question. Why is it so difficult for people? And when I say people, I'm obviously referring to you, the audience, you human beings with your arms and your legs and your head and your credit cards. Why is it so difficult for you to grasp the basic difference between a port, a remake, and an emulation? Why do people call the HD release of, let's say, Shadow of the Colossus for the PS3 a remake when it very clearly isn't? Why is there some crazed lunatic in the comments of my Super Mario World episode insisting that the Game Boy Advance port is in fact a remake? And why does nobody seem to spot an emulation when they see one? I don't know. I mean, I've lost a lot of sleep over this, but in the end I've decided that I can either have a massive temper tantrum followed by a hot chocolate and a nap, or I can try to educate you lot about the basic difference between the three. Then have a massive temper tantrum, a hot chocolate and a nap. So, without further ado, video games were big business in the late 70s and early 80s. Arcade cabinets were everywhere, from convenience stores to laundromats and bars, and even some funeral parlours if Wikipedia is to be believed. The agony of losing a loved one never truly goes away, but it can be tempered somewhat by absolutely thrashing their Pac-Man high score. Games didn't have the decency to stay in funeral homes where they belonged either. They started popping up in living people's actual homes as well. Between 1979 and 1982, there were over a dozen separate home consoles on the market, and it seemed like every bugger with a TV and $300 to spare had one of these bleeping, blooping boxes sitting on the carpet in front of their telly box. Meanwhile, back in Britain, the home computer market was flourishing, with systems like the ZX Spectrum, the BBC Micro, and the Commodore 64 attracting armfuls of bedroom coders to develop their own games like Manic Miner, Jet Set Willy, and Attack of the Mutant Camels. That is an actual name of a real game that actually existed. With the boom in home consoles and computers, home versions of existing arcade titles were an inevitability. The prospect of being able to play games like Pac-Man, Space Invaders, and Donkey Kong in the comfort of their own poorly decorated living rooms was simply too enticing. Now you might think, hey Ben, what does any of this detailed information about the video game industry of the early 80s have to do with video game ports, you dolt? You idiot, you poor man's Charlie Brooker, you bootleg Chris Pratt circa Parks and Rec Season 1, you sack of factory-grade chicken leavings? To which, I say, that's really mean and rude. I mean, I was just, I was trying to, set the scene for where ports come from and, trying to establish their humble beginnings. Jesus. See, someone had to port all of these games to the home systems, and inevitably that task would be given to very small teams of people trying to recreate or approximate the arcade originals, in many instances with little or no access to the original source material. Often a home version would be developed by one person who'd be lucky if they had hands-on access to an actual arcade machine of the game they were porting. Not to mention the fact that often the hardware of those home systems just wasn't up to the task, resulting in games that don't quite play like their arcade counterparts. A prominent example of this is the famous Atari 2600 port of Pac-Man, which is such a terrible, unfaithful port of the arcade classic that shortly after its release, everyone involved with its development was pushed out to sea on a barge, probably. But despite all these mediocre ports, the video game industry of the early 80s was booming. Then it wasn't. Then it was again, this time with better hardware. Consoles like the NES and the Sega Master System were doing well, but the practice of porting games picked up more or less where it had left off, with very small teams handling porting duties. The only difference was that as well as bringing arcade titles onto the small screen, they were porting games originally developed for one home system to another. And ports were still being handled by very small teams who had to recreate the games as faithfully as they could within the allotted time frame. Teams of 2 or 3 were incredibly common, particularly for home computer ports such as the Amiga version of Midway's immensely popular arcade murder simulator Smash TV, which was coded by former software hacksman Zara Z.K. Johans, who handled the entire game code while Mark Knowles took care of the graphics and Tony Williams bashed out the sounds. That's 3 people, 3 entire humans handling a port of a flagship arcade title to the most popular home computer in Europe of the time, from scratch, without access to the original game assets or source code. That sort of thing started to become less and less the norm as the 90s rolled on and more games were being developed with multi-platform releases in mind, or at the least were being better managed so that after-the-fact ports weren't always hot garbage. These days, games are usually developed with multi-platform releases in mind from the beginning, often using external frameworks such as the Unreal Engine or ID Tech or whatever the hell this. What is this? What am I looking at? Or just as often, not using any of those things. It's also a lot easier to fart out a game onto multiple platforms when you know which platforms it's going to end up on. And even when a game is ported to a brand new system that it wasn't originally developed for, the tools and framework are there to make the process more or less painless, though obviously the end result is it's not always perfect. This is not great. That's not to say that old games don't still get brand new from the ground up ports. They still do, predominantly on handheld systems and mobile phones. But these days, most developers opt to wrap the original game code in an emulator instead. Emulators have been used by PC gamers and retro gaming enthusiasts to play old titles, skirt copyright, and bootleg Pokemon games for donkey's years now, whether the developers want us to or not. But they're also used by developers to put old games onto new systems, especially now that home consoles are actually powerful enough to run the bloody things. Developers go with emulation because it's easier than throwing together a fresh port, or the source code for the original game has long since been lost to time, or both. The practice of using emulators was pioneered by Sega of all people, who hired a chap named Steve Snake, the developer of a fab little Genesis emulator from the late 90s called K-Gen. Sega had Snake write a custom version of his emulator for 2 PC compilations of Genesis titles. This is something of a special case, because not only does this release do a halfway decent job of emulating the games, but it actually renders the split screen mode in Sonic the Hedgehog 2 as 2 full-size screens, rather than squishing them down vertically like what the console does. These days, emulated releases such as Nintendo's Virtual Console offerings and Sega's own Genesis Classics range on Steam aim to create as authentic an experience as is possible. If a developer is going to try to enhance the original experience, then we'll either get a brand new port, such as the 2011 port of Sonic CD for the 360, PS3 and Windows, or, and this is even rarer, we'll see releases like Grim Fandango Remastered or the special editions of the first 2 Monkey Island games. Now, I know what you're thinking. Aren't the Monkey Island special editions remakes? Well, yes, but also no. Because even though LucasArts went to the trouble of creating brand new assets, artwork, music, sound effects, recording voiceover, etc., all of that stuff is just layered on top of the original game source code. So, I don't know. In fact, in what is probably the biggest fuck you to George Lucas ever to come out of his own company, you can actually switch seamlessly between the original mode and the special edition mode at any point in the game with the press of a button. So does that mean the special editions are ports and remakes? Well, I don't know. I'm not an expert. That's not so.
You are an expert.
I am. Since when? I guess. Shit. All right. Let's talk about remakes for a bit. Since when the fuck did that? A remake is a whole new game, either directly or loosely based off of an older game, but usually containing vastly different content. For example, the 2002 GameCube version of Resident Evil has almost nothing in common with the 1996 original, save for the story and a few of the puzzles. Someone playing the GameCube remake is going to have a completely different experience from someone playing the PS1 original. I think one of the reasons people get confused is because the gaming press like to use the words port and remake interchangeably, which is a very polite, very British way of saying that they keep using the wrong bloody word. It's like saying that the Blu-ray release of Singin' in the Rain is a remake when it's absolutely not. It's a brand new release of the same content on a brand new platform, you fucking caveman. Oh, so you're a caveman with no Blu-ray player. Of course, the GameCube version was later ported to the Wii in 2008, and then to the 360, Xbone, PS3, PS4 and PC in 2014, so those are ports of a remake, which is definitely not confusing at all. So hopefully that has done a pretty decent-ish job of explaining the difference between these three things for you. So hopefully now you feel a little bit more educated, a little bit wiser, feel like you've learned something, not just necessarily about how games are made, and not even about how you play the games that you love, but maybe even a little something about yourself. You see, if you've been using the wrong word this whole time, and you've done no research into whether that word's accurate, maybe today you've learned that you're a fucking moron. I think that's a very valuable lesson to have, not because it should hurt. Those words shouldn't leave you pained in any way. You should be emboldened by that. The discovery now means you can step forward throughout the rest of your life not being a goddamn imbecile. You can actually take this experience and grow. You can learn to actually do some fucking due diligence and research things. Maybe this is what sets you off on the path of that research assistant career. Maybe you'll become a psychologist, maybe you'll become an archaeologist, maybe you'll become a psycho-archaeologist, a crazy person who goes into dig sites with hammers and just murders a bunch of people, buries their skeletons, and then digs them up again. Because that's what you do for kicks. That's how life worked out for you. And I'm glad I could help make that happen. That's been the end of this week's episode. Next time, which might be next week, I don't know my life yet, we'll be talking about an actual game that is a port, and we'll be playing it. I'll be talking to you like an educated person because now you know the difference between peanut butter and chocolate. Thank you so much for watching the show. I know it's been a while since I produced the show regularly, but hoping to get back into the regular swing of things. So don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel if you want more PortsCenter, or more importantly, if you want more Chainsaw Suit original stuff like Movies with Mikey. Mikey has had some phenomenal success with the show recently, so big thumbs up to him. I'm going to be doing a vote. I'm stealing Mikey's thing from Movies with Mikey. I'm going to let you guys choose what the next episode of PortsCenter is going to be about. So here are your choices. You can either vote for Street Fighter 2 on the Amiga and its sequels. I'm more than happy to discuss those with you. Or, if you want to shoot things rather than punch them, there's Doom and Doom 2 for the Game Boy Advance. Lots to talk about there. Fascinating development history. Or, if you want something a little bit different, how about Daikatana for the Game Boy Color? It didn't get released in the US, did get released in Japan and in Europe. I'd love to talk to you guys about that. So cast your votes, leave a comment below, or you can tweet me at PortsCenter or at Ben Paddon and let me know which one you would like to see next. If you want to support me in making more stuff like this, more PortsCenter, more British Can You Authority, you can back me on Patreon. You can make a pledge of however many dollars you want a month. I am trying to do behind the scenes content, bonus content for Patreon backers. So do go to patreon.com/Ben Paddon if you want to support me in making more of this nonsense. Thank you very much for watching the episode. Again, you guys are awesome. Thanks for supporting me. And I will see you next time with whatever it is you've chosen. Thanks and take care, and goodbye forever. And until next time, goodbye forever.